Chapter 3. Lamech, guilty or not guilty? And said to the judges, Take heed what ye do, for ye judge not for man, but for the Lord, who is with you in the judgment. 2 Chron. 19.6. A questionable controversy exists in the life of the Bible's first recorded polygamist. His name is Lamech. To properly judge this man, and what he did, requires a little sleuthing. Through the history and deductions of biblical scholars, information can be obtained as to Lamech's character, which can help in our justly condemning or approving of his actions. The first uncertainty of Lamech's life is in his lineage. In chapter 5 of Genesis there is a line of genealogy from Adam and Seth down to the sons of righteous Noah, listing about a dozen of some of the most noble men that ever lived. Included in this record is Lamech, the father of Noah. He lived to be 777 years old and witnessed many important events of that time. Lamech is also mentioned in Genesis chapter 4 as being the descendant of Cain. Among his accomplishments were mentioned the killing of a young man and the taking of 2 wives. Some scholars suggest that the Lamechs of Genesis 4 and 5 were identical, as is mentioned in the following references. According to some critics, the Cainite Lamech of Genesis 4 and the Sethite Lamech of Genesis 5 were originally identical, with the 2 genealogies coming from one common legend or source. The J document, ch. 4, preserved one variant list, and the P document, ch. 5, preserved another. Zondervan's Encyclopedia of the Bible, vol. 3862. It is interesting to compare this passage with the Cainite genealogy in 4. Here we have 9 generations, there 6. Omitting the first 3 names in ch. 5, we find that of the remaining 2, Enoch and Lamech, are identical. It is difficult to escape the suggestion that we have 2 descensions of one and the same genealogy, diverging at an early period and current in different circles, yet both springing from the same source. Abingdon Bible Commentary, page 225. Therefore, according to this information, these 2 Lamechs should be considered as the same person. However, it seems more probable, after closely studying these 2 chapters of Genesis, that there were 2 different and distinct individuals named Lamech, coming through 2 different lineages. Both probably lived polygamy, but the written account in Genesis 4:19 of the taking of 2 wives pertains to the Cainite Lamech. So let's look further into his life and experiences. There are only 7 verses in the Bible from which we can draw the life story of this Lamech. As previously mentioned, he was the first recorded polygamist, but there probably were others before him, even though there is no record of them. There were thousands of monogamists too, but there is almost no mention of them specifically. From the creation of man to the time of the flood, a span of 1600 years, we could probably not list many over a dozen who were recorded monogamists. It is because of such gaps in biblical history that it is difficult to draw many absolute convictions. To judge a man like Lamech, we must look into all the facts, incidents and pieces of evidence, just as a master criminal lawyer must do. As in many court cases today, the final verdict often comes as a surprise. The case against Lamech may be a similar case. For centuries men have labeled Lamech with the twin crimes of murder and adultery, but we shall present his case with a court of last resort in his defense. There may be more to this man's lifestyle than meets the eye, especially to those who have been so quick to judge him because of his polygamy. Lamech made this comment to his 2 wives, I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Gen. 4:23. Many people who read this immediately assumed that he was a murderer and an adulterer, allying the 2 together as the twin crimes of Lamech. But to assume that Lamech is guilty of murder, and therefore his polygamy was necessarily evil, too, is poor reasoning. If we would take this attitude, we could say that Adam, who supposedly was a monogamist, committed a sin that brought death to all mankind, therefore, monogamy is evil. Or, Cain, who was a monogamist and killed his brother, shows that monogamy is also evil. But let us gather a little more insight into Lamech's character and attitude concerning this allegation of murder. We will call upon the renowned Dr. Martin Luther, who gives a justification for this killing by Lamech. Lamech's very words show that he was a proud person who did not grieve over the murder he had committed, but even gloried in it as a righteous cause, and he had a righteous cause for the murder. Furthermore, Lamech tried to defend himself by establishing a law which would prove that he had a just cause for the murder he committed. Luther's Works, vol. 1 322. Luther is assuming that since a man was killed by Lamech, that it must have been a murder, although he recognizes a hint of self-justification for the killing. He also indicates that there was, or should be, a law to justify the killing of that young man. To help solve this mystery, we shall take the testimony of Dr. Adam Clarke, who is perhaps recognized as the foremost scholar of biblical history. Clarke admits that the few verses and sayings of Lamech are controversial, and his speech is very dark, but his analysis and interpretation provide a very revealing and important summary. The verse in question reads, "I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt," but according to Dr. Clarke, it should be read, "I have slain a man for wounding me, and a young man for bruising me." This would be a reason for Lamech's killing the young man. Dr. Clarke continues to explain that Lamech had originally put this incident down into a poem which probably would have read, "And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear ye my voice? Wives of Lamech, hearken to my speech. For I have slain a man for wounding me, and a young man for having bruised me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, also Lamech 70 and 7. Clarke's Bible Commentary, Vol. 162. Continuing, Dr. Clarke explains, "It is supposed that Lamech had slain a man in his own defense, and that his wives, being alarmed lest the kindred of the deceased should seek his life in return, to quiet their fears he makes this speech, in which he endeavors to prove that there was no room for fear on this account, for if the slayer of the willful murderer, Cain, should suffer a sevenfold punishment, surely he, who should kill Lamech for having slain a man in self-defense, might expect a 77-fold punishment." Clarke's Bible Commentary, Vol. 162. This clarifies the 77-fold punishment that Lamech was talking about. There is apparently no other explanation as the meaning of that verse, so it is evident that the poem had a literal and correct translation. Lamech, therefore, had a justifiable reason for what he did. It is interesting to look at the early history of sin and its consequences upon man. The first sin of the Bible was eating forbidden fruit. The penalty was death, pain, sorrow, and weeds. The effect still lingers on. 1. The second sin was Cain's killing Abel. The consequence was his being a fugitive, a vagabond, and the earth would not yield its strength, and his children would also suffer the same consequences. 1. The next supposed sin was that of Lamech's having 2 wives. Polygamy already showed up in the first book of the Bible, and as early as the 4th chapter. But the good book is silent about this being a sin. In those early days, God would bless or punish his children as soon as they obeyed or disobeyed his commandments. It was particularly important that he do so, since so many generations thereafter would use those histories as a guide. Since Lamech was accused of murder and adultery, surely God would have mentioned it, but not a word was said against this man in the Bible text. We read that God destroyed 23,000 Israelites in one day because of their sin of fornication, see 1 Cor. 10:1-9, but he let Lamech off without even a rebuke for having 2 wives. God had a man stoned to death because he gathered some sticks on the Sabbath day to make a fire. See Num. 15:32-37. If God was so severe in such a minor crime, would he not have done something about a man who was guilty of polygamy or adultery? He could have at least mentioned it. Since Cain, who was guilty of murder, had a curse put upon his posterity as well as himself, then let's see if the same curse for the same broken commandment followed Lamech, especially if he were guilty of both murder and adultery. We will call on Reverend Summers to testify in Lamech's behalf, from his understanding of the King James translation. God did not even hint to Lamech that he had done anything wrong, but blessed him and his sons, and they became the most eminent men of that period. Lamech became the first poet the world ever produced, and to him was awarded the immortal honor of compassing the first poetry which was recorded upon the sacred pages of God's Word. For in the Hebrew from which our Bible was translated, Lamech's language was in poetry. 2 of his sons became the great heads of 2 leading branches of industry, and his other son became the great progenitor of all musicians, a leading accomplishment in every age. Indeed, a careful examination of the scriptures shows that Lamech's sons attained more prominence than the sons of any other man had done, for several generations, more prominence, too, than any did attain, for a number of generations afterwards. In fact, Lamech and his sons acquired more eminence in music, in poetry, in mechanics, and in pastoral pursuits than any man and his sons did during the first 1500 years of the world's history. We learn from these facts that in the very beginning, God blessed polygamy and the offspring of a man who had 2 wives. And the Bible tells us that God changes not, that with him there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. See Malachi 3:6, James 1:17. When Lamech took those 2 wives, not 1/7 part of Adam's life had passed, and from then until today, polygamy has always been practiced. As the most learned of all Christian commentators remarks, from Lamech to the present day, polygamy has been retained, practiced, and defended. Marriage, or The Bible and Polygamy, by Rev. W.M. D. Summers, pages 13 to 14. Thus, it can be seen from the Bible that God did not curse Lamech for adultery or polygamy. As the nature of his polygamy is considered, we clearly see that God gave no word of reproof for it. If Lamech's polygamy was an honorable type of marriage, then we can understand why he was not condemned by God for it, just as Moses and many others were not condemned for living polygamy. More light is shed on this account of Lamech from another ancient record, more recently discovered. In Genesis 5:35 of the inspired version of the Bible, it states that Lamech became master of a secret society to which Cain belonged. Lamech is accredited with killing the man for exposing the secrets of that satanic organization. Whether the man had made an oath to suffer the penalty of death if he should reveal those secrets, we do not know. We are not sure if Lamech killed this man in self-defense, or if he was an appointed executioner for a justifiable crime, or if he just took matters into his own hands and killed him because of what he considered the wrongful breaking of an oath. In conclusion, however, it is plainly evident that neither in the Bible nor in these other ancient texts came a word of reproof for Lamech's polygamy. Therefore, from biblical facts, we must rest our case in defense of Lamech's practice of plural marriage and conclude that it was not condemned by God.